I did a quick Google search this morning and found out that there are 2,400 religions in the world. Now, I didn't say churches. Think about that. 2,400 religions in the world. That's hard to believe, but excuse me, I'm sure it's close to true. We're going into an interesting study this morning. It's Paul going to Greece. He's going to Athens. And he's running into an area that is very religious. And he's going to say that in just a few moments. In fact, it's interesting. There are some scholars that say that this is the worst sermon Paul ever preached, and he did a horrible job with this sermon. I've heard those, some of those people who believe that, and they make a pretty good case. But there are other people, other scholars, who say that Paul did a genius job in preaching in Greece or in Athens. I personally, while I'll yield some to the scholars who say it was a bad sermon, I think it was a great sermon that he preached, and we're going to look at that, and I'm going to tell you why as we go through here together. Paul had been through all kinds of problems and all kinds of issues, and I won't back up with those and mention all the different cities where he had been, but he recently had been in Berea. And in a lot of those cities, he had been run out of town. Not only run out of town, he had been beaten out of town with some of those cities. He had been treated horribly, but Paul was that ever-ready bunny that I mentioned a week or two ago. He just kept coming. He just kept preaching the gospel. But in Athens, he changed his perspective. I don't know if, I don't believe it is, because he decided that, well, this wasn't working too well. I was getting myself whipped out of town. I don't think it was that at all. I think this was how God led him. But I want us to look at that together and see what's here. When he left Berea, he had to travel somewhat to get to the coast. He got to the coast and he took a ship or a boat 300 miles to get to Athens in Greece. Some people said he needed a cruise by this time. Well, I'm sure that it wasn't anything like the kind of cruises that we have today, but hopefully it did give him a chance to get better, to allow God to heal him physically and spiritually and emotionally, because he had been through such difficult situations. But we're going to pick up looking back at the 22nd verse, and where it says, "So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said," now let me stop there. I hate to stop too many times, but I'll try not. We need to clarify certain things. The Areopagus was a famous area in Athens. If we go back and read beginning the first verse of the 17th chapter of Acts, we'll see that Paul had arrived there by himself. He was waiting for Timothy and Titus to get there and to engage in the kind of ministry that Paul was used to engaging in. He followed at first his normal course, which was going to the synagogue. Yes, they had a synagogue at Athens, and at that synagogue there were Jewish people, but there were also Gentile believers, and Saul had preached to them. But I'm sure that Saul would have, or Paul would have, just spent a lot of his time looking around at this beautiful place that was Athens. It was so interesting. Athens and Greece, 400 or 500 years before, had been the musical pursuits. The arts were very much a part of the country of Greece. It had been the philosophical capital of the world. It's the place where the idea of a democracy came from. And so if you could switch back time 400 or 500 years before Paul got there, you would see the splendor of Athens. But by the time Paul got there, it wasn't such a city of splendor. Still beautiful, but it was beautiful to a large extent because of the history and because of the wonderful architecture that by this time had taken on some age. But I know that Paul would have spent some time going around to the different areas at the Parthenon and other places, and would have seen that Greek culture and the Greek architecture, and would have enjoyed that. So we also know, we're going to see it in just a moment, that his heart is burning. It's like somebody said to Paul when he got off of this cruise ship, Paul, you need to just be quiet at first. You need to recoup. You need to get R&R. You need to relax and just be quiet and enjoy the beauty of Athens. And he tried. He really tried. You read through these verses and you can tell that. And then, though, when we get to the 22nd verse, it says, so Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, he's on Mars Hill is where he is, he said, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. One of the things I want us to make sure we know and understand is the difference between being religious and being a born-again Christian. They're not the same thing at all. There are many people in Hartselle that are quite religious, but they don't necessarily know Jesus Christ as their personal Savior and Lord. There are some of them who would have a very hard time verbalizing that. I've engaged in some conversation, and if you ask somebody, well, how do you become a Christian? Then many of these very nice people that are quite good with words, can't tell you how you actually become a born-again believer in Jesus Christ. Many times they'll go back, and I've had this happen to me in a conversation many times. Many times they'll go back and they'll start talking to you about what I would call being religious, doing religious activities, doing religious things. Oh, yes. Well, I've gone to church all my life. It has nothing to do with being a born-again Christian. You could go to church 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. That does not make you a born-again Christian. Hopefully it would help you to become a born-again Christian, but that's being religious and not being a born-again Christian. I know you know this, but I want us to go over it again so that we as a church clearly understand that when we're talking to people. I hear people witnessing sometimes, and I want to say to them, I want to whisper in your ear, talk to them about Jesus. Talk to them about Jesus. That's how we come to know God, is through Jesus Christ. And sharing on that personal level, being born again, inviting Him into our lives to be our Savior and Lord. There are people who believe that, or who will say to you, yes, I go to church and I was born in a Christian home. Being born in a Christian home doesn't make you a born-again person. Hopefully it will lead you to that, but it doesn't make you that way. I heard an old preacher say one time he had a kitty cat that was born in a bread box, but that didn't make it a biscuit. Not the same thing. I find that Christians are becoming more confused on these issues than they ever have been in my adult lifetime. They can't clearly share how you come to know Christ as Savior and Lord. They will talk about all kinds of other things. They are religious, but they're not born-again Christians. He says now, he said, I can see that you're religious. And Athens was covered with idols. In fact, the story is, I don't know if this is true, but they say that a couple of hundred years before this time, when Paul was there in Athens, they brought a flock of sheep into the city of Athens, and they watched those sheep. And everywhere those sheep would lie down, they would put another religious statue or idol. They'd kill one of the poor sheep and offer it as a sacrifice to that idol. And then they'd punch the sheep, make them get up and walk off and go somewhere else and lie down. And that's how they came with all these. However they did it, Athens was covered with idols. And he says, for as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. That unknown comes from the Greek word gnosis, Gnosis in English letters. A gnosis or gnosko is a knowing that is more than just knowing 1 plus 1 is 2, but gnosis represents an experiential knowing it on a very deep level. And he saw this inscription that was to agnosis, or where we get the word agnostic, not really believing one way or the other. Paul saw this agnostic inscription that was on this idol, to an unknown God, and he's calling that to their attention. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. I see this idol. It's offered to maybe the God we might have missed. When that sheep flock had been going around 200 years ago, they laid down here in this one spot, and we didn't have a God to put there. Zeus or whatever, all of those were taken up, so we just put a beautiful monument there and wrote on it, this is to the God that we might have missed. We don't know the name or whatever, but I think Paul did a brilliant job with this. Normally when Paul would go into these cities, Philippi, Thessalonica, Iconium, and etc., he would go to the Old Testament and he would talk about Moses, and he would talk about Abraham and talk about David, and etc., because most of those places, even the ones that were Greek, had some kind of a Bible background. That's where he started. But in Athens, that was not true. The majority of these people knew nothing about the Old Testament. So using that as a segue would not have worked as well. Now, there are scholars that say he should have. I disagree. I think he made the right move here, and he was talking to them about these little gods, and that they did appear to be religious, and he's going to tell them about that God, the one that they don't know. Here's a big point that we've got to catch, because it's just staring us in the face. It is God who has chosen to reveal himself. We would know nothing of God if God had not chosen to reveal himself. I don't know if you've ever fooled with a 35 millimeter camera. It has an aperture, and you can change the dial around and open up the aperture. The aperture controls the amount of light that gets to the field. And so if you're taking a picture on a very bright, sunny day, you keep that aperture way down, almost closed, just let in a small amount of that light. And then there are other days when it's lots of shadows, etc. You turn that aperture so that it's wide open. God chose to open the aperture, if you will, of the world wide open to reveal himself. You hear people say incorrectly all the time, I've been searching for God. I'm so glad I searched for God and I found God. You cannot search for God and find God. God reveals himself. We would know nothing about God if God had not chosen to reveal himself. And so God chose to give us 66 books that we call the Bible that reveals himself. And then the ultimate revelation of God, the revealing of God, it started in a manger in Bethlehem when Jesus was born, God in the flesh. And we could look at Jesus, and the first chapter of John tells us that we're looking at a perfect mirror image of God. We beheld him. We beheld his glory. We would not have beheld him. We would not have beheld his glory if God had not chosen to reveal himself through Jesus Christ. You could be the greatest student in all the world. You could go up on the top of the highest mountain, Mount Mitchell, highest mountain in the eastern United States, go up on the top and just think and think and think and think, trying to figure out God. It's not going to happen. It's not going to work. Good news is you don't have to do that. God has chosen to reveal himself. And that's the big point that Paul is trying to make here. Because these people were religious people. They were involved in religious activities. And Paul is saying to them, God has revealed himself. You see that statue out there that says to the unknown God? Well, you can know God not because you figured him out, not because you have great philosophy, and they did. They were very proud. God is saying to them, you know that because God has revealed himself, and he'll talk to them in a minute about revealed himself in Jesus Christ. He says, what therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven, does not live in temples made by hand. Now he is in a place where there are some of the most beautiful, intricate temples in the world. That's where he is right now. He's standing there. He could have hit them with a rock. And he's telling them God doesn't dwell in these temples that are made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything. You can't do something for God. I'm going to go do something for God. No. You can't help God out. And that's what Paul is saying to them here. Since he himself gives to all mankind life, breath, everything, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for In him we live and move and have our being. Even some of your poets have said, and then he quotes one of the Greek poets in that next line. There were two kinds of prevalent philosophies when Paul was preaching in Athens. There were the Epicureans and the Stoics. The Epicureans basically believed in pleasure. If you have to choose one, that's not a bad one to choose, maybe. They believed in pleasure. Now, not the kind of pleasure that most of us might think of. It is a relaxed way of life. A great meal sometimes is called an Epicurean delight. But the Stoics were much more rigid. They believed that a God, little g, was present in everything. They were panentheists, God in all. At funerals were songs that were about when my soul is released from this prison that it's in. And it will be released to go on to be with God. That is teaching from Plato. I'm not going to go back to Eastern Kentucky and tell them that, but that's true. That's where it comes from. Plato said that man has a spark of the divine. And to this day, there are many people who, if you hear them talk, even Christians, they'll talk about, this little part of me that is divine or spiritual, and I'll be freed, it'll be freed from this prison that I'm in, this body, this prison that I'm in. As Christians, going back to the Hebrew teaching, the Hebrews teach that a body is a whole thing. It's where the word shalom comes from. And in the first couple of chapters of Genesis, it talks about man being a living nephesh. Not that man has a little bit of God in him, but the Bible teaches us that man is a whole being. And when God comes into our heart and into our lives, then it affects us wholly. W-H-O-L-E-Y. And so Paul is teaching these people. It tells us that there were two people that were saved as a result of this sermon, Dionysius and Damaris. And they wanted to hear more. And there were some people who outwardly disagreed with Paul's teaching, but then there were some who said, why don't you come back and teach some more? All of us have an opportunity to teach and preach Christ as we live our lives and as we're sharing with people. Not in a place like Athens necessarily, unless it's Athens, Alabama, or it could be in a place like Hartselle. But you've got to admire Paul's ability and his willingness to step right in there. Many of us, if we were talking to him, would probably say, Paul, you've done a lot. I know you're tired. I know you've got a hurt all through your body. I think you've earned the right to just take it easy and let somebody else, maybe Timothy or somebody else, take over. But Paul would not do that because he was called of God to preach the gospel. You have been called to God, by God, to preach the gospel if you know Christ as Savior. I didn't say you've been called to pastor a church or be a missionary, but you have been called to be a minister and to share the good news of the gospel. So let's let the story of Paul and his dedication be something that gives us strength to live our lives out in the way that God would have us live. Would you stand for our hymn of invitation, please?